A quick opening comment, and then I'm ready for your questions. I've written a letter to the Prime Minister requesting an urgent meeting of all the party leaders, given the recent threats against a member of Parliament and his family because of just doing his work. We're very concerned about that. And in the meantime, we want to know from the Prime Minister and the Liberal government, are there any other members of Parliament that have or that are subject to any similar threats? No one should be under threat of a foreign government targeting them for the work that they're doing in Parliament. And we want to make sure that this is something that is addressed. And again, it highlights how important ultimately it is for us to have a public inquiry. Donc j'ai écrit une lettre au Premier ministre pour avoir une rencontre de tous les chefs de parti pour répondre aux allégations des menaces contre un député et sa famille. C'est vraiment sérieux. Si quelqu'un travaille dans cette chambre, on ne doit pas avoir des menaces d'un gouvernement étranger. Ça, c'est un grand problème. Et on va poser la question aujourd'hui, s'il y a des autres députés qui sont sujets d'une menace comme ça, le gouvernement doit partager ça dans la Chambre de communes. With that, I'm ready for any questions.
The Prime Minister said he didn't know about this until Monday. Do you accept that? Do you take him at his word on that?
Ultimately, it doesn't matter if he knew about it or not. This is such a serious matter. It shows that when it comes to foreign interference, the Liberal government and the Prime Minister are not doing enough. Whether he knew about it, he didn't do anything about it, and didn't share that information with the Member of Parliament, that's very serious. If he didn't know about it, that's also very serious. Either way, ultimately, we are very concerned that foreign interference is not being taken seriously by this government. The Conservatives are too busy playing games to actually be concerned about getting to the truth. And we want to see a public inquiry, we want to see questions answered, and we want to see people safe to do their job without threats of foreign governments targeting them. And we want to make sure that Canadians have confidence in our democracy.
What about the diplomat being expelled? Are you in favor of that?
Yeah, there is clear evidence of a diplomat that has threatened a Canadian member of Parliament. That diplomat should no longer be in our country. There's no question about that. Getting to the truth of that, understanding what actually happened, these are all very legitimate questions. And if it turns out that the diplomat had threatened a Canadian parliamentarian that his family would have repercussions because of the way that he voted, there's no way that person should be in the country.
Does it make sense that the Prime Minister said that CSIS never really passed along the information about Michael Chong? Like, does that make sense?
The questions around what CSIS passed on to the Prime Minister or not, getting to the bottom of what actually that means really is why I believe the public inquiry is the way to go. Because there's a lot of what the Prime Minister is saying is that he did know or did not know, or some information was passed on or not passed on. And people are asking these legitimate questions. Do we believe the Prime Minister? Is that actually how it happened? This all highlights why a public inquiry would address all of those concerns. Legitimate questions that are being answered. The only way to provide real clarity is to have a forum that is transparent and that is independent to answer these questions. Canadians have many questions like that. Why were steps taken? How broad is this interference? Who is being impacted? Was it just nomination meetings? These are the types of questions Canadians are asking, and it really undermines our democracy when the government is not responding to them, when the Liberal government is ignoring the seriousness of this, and that's why we're saying the public inquiry would be the best way to respond to all these concerns.
So you're saying that Trudeau's response to this is still not enough, and what will get you there is this independent inquiry?
Yeah, and I want to be very clear. I've not at any point and still don't have concerns about Mr. Johnson as a special rapporteur. But even with a special rapporteur, I've said, absent a public process that is independent, Canadians aren't getting that reassurance that they need. And that's why I've said from the beginning, even after the announcement of the special rapporteur, we believe a public inquiry is essential. It is the only way to really respond to the concerns that Canadians have, the worries that they have, and the lack of question or the lack of answers that they've not received so far. The only way to really clear the air is to have a public inquiry.
How does this affect your relationship with the Prime Minister?
This continues to be a part of our role. We are an opposition party, and we are pointing out that the government's not doing enough in this point. This is an example of how we can continue to hold this government to account. We disagree with the approach of the government. Ignoring the call for a public inquiry is a problem, and that's why we're saying there has to be an inquiry.
En français, vu votre entente, est-ce que vous avez accès à de l'information quand même privilégiée sur même ce sujet-là?
No.
Mrs. Singh, do you have questions about why CSIS didn't inform the Prime Minister about this? I mean, he only found about this on Monday. Is there some questions to be asked about the spy agency?
on a separate, unrelated, I mean, in general, I've raised concerns about the fact that CSIS has, in the past, engaged in activities that I don't agree with. The fact that they've targeted and discriminated people based on their religion, the targeting of the Muslim community without any evidence. I really believe that security agencies and policing should be evidence-based and should not be discriminatory. We know that when you discriminate against someone based on their name or where they're from or their religion, that is a bad use of resources. It means that real threats are ignored because a discriminatory practice targets one group at the exclusion of real threats. And we saw that when right-wing extremists were ignored as a threat in the United States, and the real threats that they posed were not taken seriously. And we saw the outcome of that with January 6th. Similarly, in Canada, far too often, real threats have been ignored, and those that have been discriminated against have been receiving all the attention unfairly and unjustly, and it's not been an evidence-based approach. So I've got concerns about CSIS and their practices in general. In this matter, I don't have enough information to make an assessment of CSIS behavior in this matter. I've got lots of critiques in other areas. On this matter, I want to see a public inquiry to answer these questions. Those are the type of questions that should be answered in a public inquiry. Is CSIS doing enough? Are they informing people appropriately? What information are they giving respecting national security, but are they giving enough information for people to act on or not? These are questions that a public inquiry could satisfy. Did you want to follow up? Yeah, go ahead.
He was only informed on Monday, according to the Prime Minister. Is that the right way to go about the work of a spy agency if you're only informing the Prime Minister? If you're not informing the Prime Minister about what's happening to MPs?
I mean, if that's the case, if the case is that a member of Parliament was threatened by a diplomat in Canada and his family was threatened, and CSIS did not provide that information to the Prime Minister, I don't know if that's the case, but if that is the case, that is a serious and obvious problem.
How much faith do you have in CSIS, and do you think the head of CSIS should be fired?
I don't have enough information to make that assessment. I know that, as I've raised, in general, I've had concerns about the lack of attention to real threats that Canadians are facing by CSIS, and instead targeting people based on discriminatory practice. That's happened in the past, and that is wrong. That's something I want to see changed. In terms of the approach to this question of foreign interference and China, I don't have enough information about CSIS to assess whether or not they're doing their job appropriately. But I do know that the government, that the Liberal government and the Prime Minister, given how serious this is, are not taking it seriously enough. The Conservatives are too interested in just turning this into a game. I'm very concerned about our democracy, safeguarding it, making sure members of Parliament, whether we agree with them or not, are able to do their job free from the fear of being targeted by foreign governments. These are things that I want to address because I think they're very serious.
Sur la monarchie, M. Singh, merci. On dirait que le débat sur le serment au roi reprend de l'ampleur. Il y a des libéraux qui disent qu'ils aimeraient ça que ce soit optionnel et puis que le contexte fait en sorte que cette idée-là est encore plus populaire aujourd'hui qu'elle était il y a quelques mois. Vous, votre position, c'est quoi précisément? Est-ce que ça devrait devenir optionnel? Est-ce que votre caucus est à l'aise avec le serment au roi?
Donc, je sais que c'est un débat et une question pour des gens, mais pour moi, personnellement, et pour mon parti et comme chef de parti, ce n'est pas une priorité. Dans ce temps maintenant, ma priorité, c'est l'ingérence étrangère. Ma priorité, c'est le fait qu'on a un coût de la vie qui augmente et le gouvernement libéral ne répond pas aux besoins des gens. On a une inflation qui continue, particulièrement pour le coût d'épicerie. Donc, j'ai beaucoup d'inquiétudes, beaucoup de priorités. Je veux livrer les soins dentaires qu'on a forcé le gouvernement de faire au fin de cette année. Donc, on a plusieurs priorités et pour moi, ce n'est pas un des...
Mais si le débat vient de l'avant, excusez-moi, si le débat vient de l'avant, quelle serait la position du NPD sur la question? Je comprends que vous n'allez pas l'amener, mais si elle vient de l'avant, parce qu'il y a de vos députés qui ne sont pas à l'aise avec la monarchie.
Donc, si c'est une question qui est soulevée et s'il y a une vote, on verra. Mais pour moi, ce n'est pas une priorité. Pour moi, à ce moment, je continue de mettre tous mes efforts pour répondre aux besoins des gens. Pas comme les libéraux qui veulent laisser toutes les choses statu quo. Pour moi, ce n'est pas acceptable. Donc, je continue de forcer ce gouvernement de livrer l'aide aux gens, de faire plus pour faire face à l'inflation. Et maintenant, on a une peur d'une récession qui s'en vient. Donc, on a besoin d'une assurance emploi qui est là. Donc, il y a plusieurs choses pour moi qui sont sur mon dossier important. Donc, ce n'est pas une des priorités pour moi.
Il y a un député libéral, René Arsenault, qui, lui, dit « Moi, ça me ferait plaisir de travailler sur une motion pour visant à rendre ça optionnel, le serment du roi. Donc, ça se pourrait que ça arrive bientôt. Donc, comment vous, personnellement, vous positionnez? Est-ce que vous êtes en faveur que ce soit optionnel?
C'est une option qu'une députée peut soulever et puis on verra et on va évaluer. Mais maintenant, ce n'est pas une priorité pour moi. Il y a plus de choses qui prennent le temps important pour moi de même mes efforts et je vais continuer de faire tout ce que je peux pour aider les Canadiens qui disent que je ne peux pas trouver du logement abordable. Comment vous pouvez m'aider avec ça? Ça, c'est une priorité.
Mr. Singh, don't you want to hear from the director of CSIS to find out exactly what happened? If they had information that Michael Chong was being intimidated by China and his family in Hong Kong or whatever, and the Prime Minister said it was never passed up the chain, isn't it time to bring David Vigneault to a committee and get to the bottom of it?
There are a lot of witnesses, and the head of CSIS is one witness that could provide some important answers to questions that Canadians have, and I think that we should hear from him. I've long said, though, that the committee process isn't the ideal process for that. I think a public inquiry is still the better process, having the independence, where it's not about trying to score points, but truly about getting to the bottom of what's happening in our country, how interference is impacting our democracy, and really looking at solutions. So I still maintain that a public inquiry is the best way, but in the meantime, that we should use the tools that we have, and we have been pushing for pushing for witnesses to come forward, and that's a witness that I would absolutely think would be an important witness to hear from.
Sur ces 21 les armes à feu, M. Singh, sur ces 21 et les armes à feu, qu'est-ce que vous répondez à Police se souvient, qui est en furie contre vous et les libéraux, qui dit que vous les avez trahis en adoucissant les amendements?
Je respecte énormément le travail de Police se souvient. Il tient encore un attentat horrible au Québec, à Montréal, et ils sont le voix pour les survivants, pour les familles des victimes. Donc, je comprends comment pour eux, ils font un travail incroyable, important, et je respecte leur travail. Ce qu'on a fait, c'est de reconnaître, premièrement, que le gouvernement libéral a mal géré ce dossier. Évidemment, ils ont aussi admis qu'ils ont mal géré le dossier. Pour nous, notre priorité, c'était toujours d'avoir un projet de loi qui fonctionne. Un projet de loi qui rend les communautés plus sécuritaires et en travaillant avec le projet de loi, on a forcé le gouvernement d'améliorer les choses et maintenant, on a une approche qui va cibler les fabricants. Je pense que ça, c'est quelque chose de positif et c'est aussi complètement nouvelle. C'est une approche nouvelle. On va arrêter les armes à feu avant qu'ils entrent dans le marché au Canada. Je pense que ça, c'est une meilleure façon de contrôler les armes à feu. Donc, c'est grâce à nous. On a des mesures pour respecter les communautés autochtones grâce à nos efforts. C'est important et on va continuer d'être une voix pour avoir une communauté qui est sécuritaire.
Ça s'applique pas au marché.
Do you think there's any chance having a public inquiry before addressing the issues of discrimination with CSIS could hurt minority communities even more?
This is a major question that we're up against. We have seen historically that CSIS has targeted minority communities in an unfair, discriminatory, and frankly, bad way. It actually hurts our efforts to keep Canada safe when communities are targeted just because of their language, their religion, their identity. That is a bad use of resources. That being said, I think a public inquiry is still essential to respond to the serious questions that are coming up around foreign interference. We believe that is the way forward. We still can find ways to improve CSIS and their approach to minority communities and make sure that we're doing everything possible to respond to the real threats that Canadians are faced with. Thank you so much, merci.